Good morning. Thanks for coming to class. A bunch of people turned stuff in yesterday. Not sure why they did it yesterday, or maybe that was the last day I told you you guys could turn stuff in. So I'm guessing that was it. So if you turned stuff in yesterday and I haven't graded it, just give me some time. Some of you turning in stuff like a month late, so you got to give me more than 30 minutes to grade it. All right. And I think your weekly question was graded if you turned it in on time or a little bit late. I'll go back and do some more grading today and tomorrow to catch up. And then there you go. We're good. I was looking at due dates. You have a weekly question this week. Next week is the book review. And then the week after that is the last weekly question. You, of course, can turn that one in early if you like. And you have a quiz that last week. I'll put in a quiz review by the end of the week. I hate to give you any promises, but by the end of the week. I also put in an optional question. So that's really essentially extra points if you want to do it. It really is optional. It won't count against you. I've had some more emails where people ask me about the grade, how I'm figuring the grades. And really, what I said in the announcement is really what I'm doing. It really is. So I'm basing it on 300 points. And so you need, 270 to get an A, plus a book review, excuse me, 240 to get a B, and 210 to get a C. Those extra points really are extra. I'm not figuring those in. The extra points are the 20 for the book review and then the 10 for the optional questions. So you can keep asking me, like, how can you do that? It's like, because I can. I mean, that's how I'm doing it. That's really what I'm doing. So I'm sorry that it's confusing. I know that if you added all the points together, 270 wouldn't be 90%. But remember, the book review points are really extra, and this optional question is really extra. So I'm not adding those into the point total. I don't know any other way to tell you that. I don't know what to tell you except what I've already told. All right, let's look at weekly question and then optional question. Let me see if I can find those things. Weekly question. Oh, somebody's trying to come in. All right. Here we go. All right. So your weekly question for this coming week is, what was the basic premise of the Confederate government? What advantages did the Confederacy have, and why did its leaders think victory would be theirs? So is the government more of a states' rights government, local control government, federal control government? What sort of documents did they use? What were those documents based on? How was the government truly carried out? What advantages? Why did the Confederacy thought they would win? Both sides thought they would win. And so the question is really to ask why the Confederacy thought they would win. And you don't have to go into a whole lot of the military stuff. I mean, just a really basic discussion. But you do want to talk pretty specifically about the Confederate government. You want to talk about their constitution. You want to talk about who their leaders were, what experience they had, what international affairs or international relationships, allies they thought they could build. Be specific about that. And I'm so sorry. I'm still telling you in the rubric, to be sure to name names and put dates. It's a history class. We really like dates. And that helps you put stuff in chronological order, which helps to show potentially cause and effect or change over time. So dates always matter. So when you say the Confederacy seceded from the Union put a date in parentheses, 1864 or 1865, or excuse me, 1860 or 1861. And Jefferson Davis was elected president, and then put, that date in parentheses, just a year at the very least, just to kind of show the progress. And the Constitution was adopted, put a date in parentheses, and it said this. Okay, all right. I also pasted the optional question, which is due, I can't remember when it's due. Goodness, it's due the Monday after the book review. Monday after the book review. So probably around the 10th, May 10th, I think, maybe. But it's in the assignments page. I can look if you need me to look, but the optional question. For full credit, oh, that's the instruction part. I can delete that if you want, but that's the whole thing. On this, if you turn it in late, I'm not going to grade it. That's just, it's extra credit. Do it, don't do it. I don't care, but I'm not grading it if you turn it in late, okay? So turn it in on time. Explain one extremely important event mentioned in this class, textbook, or lectures that was not directly a part of a weekly question. Explain what the event was. That's the what, when, who was involved, and why it was a significant part of U.S. history from colonization to 1877. I am not saying you have to explain why it mattered through that whole period. I'm saying the event has to be in that period. I'm saying you can't talk about World War II, okay? So talk about something that happened from the beginning of the United States or pre-United States until Reconstruction that you thought was really important, but I didn't ask a question about. And then tell me what it was, what happened, and why you thought it was really significant. That's all there is to it, okay? It just has to fit in the time period. It has to be about the United States. And detail and analysis equals points. And, at this point, you probably know that. If you have concerns about that and you want to email me, like, is this event okay or is that event okay? Honestly, any event you think is important is okay. You just have to explain why it's important. Yeah, explain why it's important. Might be an amendment, it might be a war that because I don't think we had a direct question about like the War of 1812 or the Mexican War, or it could be, a Supreme Court ruling. You could talk about Dred Scott. I mean, anything, whatever you think is good. Yeah. And your weekly question isn't as, completely Civil War-ish. So that leaves you some options there as well. You could talk about the election of Abraham Lincoln. There's lots of stuff you could, anything I didn't ask a question about. So that's really just to kind of help. It's the extra, it's just extra points for you, but also gives you a chance to talk about something that you wished I would have asked you about. So there you go. All right. And let me know if you have questions about that and we can discuss those. And turn that in on time. Yeah. If you're wondering like why it is I don't want to grade stuff late, it's mostly because of what happened yesterday with everybody turning stuff in late. Plus, as I've mentioned, the class is almost over and my grades are due really quickly as the class is over. So that's also why if you haven't turned in the weekly question, you got to do that really, really soon from last week. And you only have 2 left. So that's the good news, right? All right. Let's look at the notes. And how does this happen? All right. Can you guys see the notes?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. You would think after teaching 8 million Zoom classes, I would know what you can see and what you can't, but I don't. I'm a history teacher and not a technology teacher. No, I know some of your other teachers are really good at technology. I'm just not. Okay. So our weekly question really is about the Confederacy, and we will probably talk about some of that today. But your chapter is also about the Civil War, and there's, the Civil War chapter, or Civil War as a subject, really full subject. I mean, in a survey class like this one, we typically talk about causes and effects and maybe a major battle or two. As I recall, on your quiz, there'll be a question about a major battle or two, so you'll want to pay some attention to the battles, but mostly just, why the battles were important. But we typically don't do a whole lot of military history in a survey class. If you like that kind of stuff when you go to college, you go away to college. I know you're taking a college class right now. I'm aware of that because I'm teaching it. But when you go away to college, you can take an elective class, maybe just about military history or just about the Civil War or something like that, to get more of the stuff that you like and less of the general stuff. Our job is the general stuff. Okay. So, that Abraham Lincoln ran for president in 1860. You also know probably the presidential elections are in even years. We do those every 4 years, and then they take office the year after. So we elect you at the end of 1860, November, but you take office in whatever month of the next year, 1861. And as time has gone along, the inauguration is, no longer in April or February. Now it's in January. I think at this time it was still in April. I think, yeah, I think so. All right. So 1860, Lincoln gets elected, and it was a consequential election because the South really refused to put Lincoln even on the ballot, because Lincoln had already said, and the party platform declared, that he opposed the spread of slavery into any new territories. And so the Southern states said, fine, we won't put you on the ballot, because each state decides who's on the ballot. And each state has different rules about how you get on the ballot. So as long as you follow those rules, you get to get on the ballot. And people just, the Southerners just said, yep, we're not putting Lincoln on the ballot. So they didn't. And so when Lincoln gets elected, in part because the Democrats split the votes 2 or 3 ways, the South had said, if Lincoln becomes president, we're out. So the discussion of secession starts immediately after Lincoln's election. And secession is the idea that you leave the Union or you secede. And the first state to leave the Union was South Carolina, and then several other states followed suit. Now they do this before Lincoln is inaugurated. So the president is Buchanan. Buchanan is kind of an interesting guy that we never talk about. Should I tell you why? I don't know. I don't know. Most historians believe that he's the only gay president we've ever had. So, and during that time period, people aren't very open about much of anything. So, that would not have been something they talked a lot about. But, the same, how Thomas Jefferson had children with one of his slaves in an apparently consensual relationship. And people acted like that was a big historical secret. But if you read local newspapers in DC, it was not anywhere close to a historical secret. Same deal with Buchanan, which, I always think is interesting because we act like this stuff's a big secret. It's just the records that would reflect that it wasn't a big secret aren't the records that we look at. We don't look at a whole lot of local newspapers when we study history. But anyway, that's neither here nor there, is it? Buchanan's main goal as president was to not be president when the Civil War started. He may have had some other goals, but my impression is that really was quite near the top. And he was successful because when South Carolina seceded, they took over a federal fort, Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter. And he just said, oh, you guys shouldn't do that. And he didn't send troops to do anything about it. So when Lincoln takes office, he says, you know what, that's a federal fort. We should at the very least resupply the fort. Now, Lincoln understood that by resupplying the fort, the Confederate troops that were there were going to shoot at the Federal troops who were trying to resupply the fort. But then it meant they started it. So that way he could declare the Confederacy in rebellion. And if he sent troops to capture the fort or to respond to South Carolina's attack on Federal troops, then he wasn't starting stuff, he was responding. So it's sort of like what we did in the Mexican War when we sent the troops between the Nueces and the Rio Grande, because we knew that would aggravate the Mexican army enough that they would attack the U.S. troops. So I'm not saying it was justified, unjustified. I don't think the South really should have seceded. I'll just say that right up front. So I'm not trying to justify what the South did or even what Lincoln did. I'm just saying that Lincoln understood that it probably was a better look for the United States if they didn't officially start stuff. So he wanted to make sure the South started stuff. Now, before all of that happened, I know I skipped something important, didn't I? The Crittenden Compromise. The Crittenden Compromise. The Crittenden was a congressman. I want to say his first name was John, but I can't remember at the moment. Crittenden was a Kentucky congressman. He was being all Henry Clay-like, not really, trying to avert the Civil War. And he said, hey, Lincoln, here's what we can do to avert the Civil War. Pass a constitutional amendment that says that slavery will be preserved forever, wherever it existed, and extends the 3630 line, so we don't have to have any of this pesky discussion about whether states should be slave or free. We don't have to have popular sovereignty. It's just if it's in the North, it's free. It's in the South, it's slave. And then wherever there's already slavery, we can't take it away. And Lincoln's like, do you pay attention to anything I said during the campaign? No. So Lincoln says no. Now, Crittenden knew that this wasn't going to work, but you got to try, I guess. But it wasn't going to work, and Lincoln said no. And then the North sends the troops or the federal government, I should say, the Union sends the troops to Fort Sumter to supply the fort. They get fired on. The Confederate troops officially take over the fort. Lincoln declares that to be an act of rebellion, which is the official start of the Civil War. All right. So advantages of the Confederacy. They were going to be able to fight a defensive war. So if you're fighting a defensive war, you're just protecting the homeland. You don't have to move the troops anywhere. The other side's going to have to come get you. If you're fighting an offensive war, you've got to do all the movement. You've got to explore territory you're not as familiar with. So defensive. They think their cause is more effective. They're defending their way of life. And because they know the territory better, because lots of Southern guys went to West Point, they probably have more people involved in the proper military, so they have more formal training. If you're wondering why that was, West Point, going into the military, and I think it's still kind of similar in some ways, it's either a way for you to establish a career and not be poor anymore, or it's a way for certain families to continue their family tradition of public service. And lots of times these families are very wealthy. Most of those very wealthy old money kind of families were in the South. Yeah, so those guys typically, sorry, I was grabbing my book here. Those guys typically would have, several sons, and one of the sons would run the plantation. It's the guys with just a ton of money. One of the guys would run the plantation. One of the guys might go off to Europe for college, learn French, all that kind of stuff. French is really trendy on plantations. and one of the sons would go to a military academy, would go into the military and hopefully go to West Point. West Point's in New York, by the way. I don't know that we ever talk about that or you're aware of that, but that's where West Point is. So yeah, it's a fairly northern place, but there's lots of fairly southern fellows that go to West Point. All right. And the book also talks quite a bit about how this is the first modern war because you have more modern weapons and you have the ability to mass produce things. So it also means the casualty rates are going to be really, really high, which they are. Okay. So knowledge of the territory in a defensive war, military leadership, most plantation families sent at least one son to a military school. And, you know, West Point's the cool one, but there are other ones. Yeah. All right. The Union advantage, everything else, more people, more money. They have an established government. They have an established military, although lots of the leadership and the members of the military are Southern. They have the established international relationships, any treaties, trade deals, all that stuff. Those are with what's left of the Union, which is the North. They have an actual Navy, the South not so much, but honestly, neither Navy is very huge, but you know, at least you have one. They have a larger and more diverse economy. It's not just based on agriculture. There's definitely more manufacturing, although you'll see um, a change in manufacturing in the South. You'll see more manufacturing, but it really starts from scratch. And most of the manufacturing that happens in the South during this time period is really going to be to produce weapons, because, you know, that's what they need. But the North also has more ability to feed its population. The South is very agricultural, as we've discussed 8 million times, but they're growing cotton, and you really should not eat cotton. So they could grow other stuff. They just choose not to because the cotton plantation owners make so much money from cotton. So yeah, it's going to be a problem during the Civil War. So manufacturing, the ability to create more quickly, and food production. I'm promising you this food production thing, can't really overlook it. And for whatever reason, people typically think because the Southern is basically agricultural and the Northern is more business oriented, that the South has the advantage in food production. They really, really do not. It's a huge problem. One of the best students I ever taught in high school, like 4.0, went on to nursing school, 4.0 there. I mean, just really super smart kid. Not really good at history, as I recall. She asked me how many sides there were in the Civil War. And I said, there's two, you know, the North and the South. And she said, you know, I don't mean to be rude to you, but I think you're wrong. And I said, that's fine. Why do you think I'm wrong? She says, well, the book talks about the North and the South, the Union and the Confederacy. Sometimes I've heard people talk about the Yankees and the rebels. Sometimes I've heard people talk about the blue and the gray. So I think there's more than two sides. So it's like, just in case you didn't know, she was really, really smart. Just history wasn't her thing. There's more than one name for each side, but there's really only two sides. We got the North and the South. And blue and the gray, it's the color of their uniforms, of course. Sorry for the yawn. Yankees and the Rebels. You've probably heard that before. I know when I first moved to Texas, somebody, friend of, I'm still friends with them to this day. I met them in 8th grade, ninth grade, said that I was a Yankee because I wasn't from Texas. That was an interesting first greeting. But yeah, Union, Confederacy, North and South, those are all the names. All right, so the first couple of years of the war, the South really does better than the North. They do, yeah, okay. The South does better than the North because they're at home. And the North is coming to the South, and they have to send all their troops. And the North also has trouble deciding who's going to be their leader. Not the not their political leader, but their military leader. So they are going to go back and forth and circle through or cycle through 4 or 5 different major generals as the head of the Confederate Army. And they struggled. I think this McClellan fellow, as I recall, and I'll go back to the notes in a second, I promise. The McClellan fellow, as I recall, graduated first in his class at West Point the same year that Robert E. Lee graduated, and Robert E. Lee was second in his class. This is also, you know how kids are, they always think the valedictorian's the smartest guy. He's probably just best at getting grades. No offense if any of you are about to be the valedictorian, because you might be the smartest guy. And we measure intelligence in 8 million different ways. But anyway, McClellan really good at military stuff in practice and on paper. But Lincoln's criticism of McClellan, who will run against him for president in 1864, in part because of his criticism, his criticism of him is that he has a case of the slows. And so he has trouble making decisions quickly when he needs to make them quickly. And I would imagine, I haven't been, in the military, thank God. I would not make the world safe for democracy. We're all better off that I was not in the military. But if you can't make a decision quickly and you're in the middle of a battlefield situation or some other sort of urgent situation, this is an enormous problem. And that's the problem that McClellan had. Robert E. Lee did not have that problem and typically made pretty good battle decisions. There are a couple times that he decides to invade the North, and it's probably a bad idea. Yeah, it turned out to be. But he overall was a really good commander. And then Grant was about 4th or 5th in line, and they ended up deciding that Grant was the guy because he was willing to follow through on certain things and to take risks that the other commanders weren't comfortable with, because those risks often caused high casualty rates. And not everybody thought that that was a good idea. Yeah, but at a certain point, they decided, you had to win the war. So that did matter, didn't it? Okay. Now, the textbook kind of goes in an odd order. So my notes go in a little bit of an odd order. I don't know if you've noticed, but I tend to try to follow the textbook with the notes, because my thought is, maybe you're reading the textbook and the notes are nearby. Never know. Yeah, be a good idea. All right. So, the South wins most of the major battles, but here's the problem with the South. Their resources are much more limited. So as time goes along, they start running out of stuff. Now, the book is going to tell you about several different battles. Just be aware that the first couple of years, pretty much the South wins all of them. It's not completely true, but it's mostly true. Now, there is some fighting that goes on in the West, and we don't talk about that very much. And the West might be the Mississippi River, but there's also some that goes on farther west in Texas and New Mexico as well, which I think is hardly mentioned at all in the book, which is fine. But Grant really starts to gain some traction in the West and is able to get control of the Mississippi River. And that's going to be a really important sort of thing. All right, back to the notes. Paul. Emancipation Proclamation, really important thing. After some pretty marginal victories in 1863. Now, Lincoln wanted to issue the Emancipation Proclamation earlier, but decided to wait until 1861, January 1st. And he decides to do this because they really hadn't won very many battles yet. So emancipating people probably didn't make a lot of sense. It didn't make it look like he wasn't going to do that until it looked like we had more of a chance, the North, I know I'm not in the North, to actually successfully win the war. And Lincoln's position on emancipation and equality and that stuff evolves pretty dramatically, in large part because of the influence of Frederick Douglass, and because he was completely convinced that slavery was wrong. That didn't change at all. And as a fairly religious fellow, becomes more and more convinced that people made in the image of God are equal and could work together and shouldn't be separate, that sort of thing. It takes time for him. All right, now, the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't really free anybody. And I trust that you're probably aware of this. It frees any slave in a rebellious state, so any state in the South. Now, the South, as we know, had seceded, and they're not paying any attention to what Abraham Lincoln said. It does not free the slaves in the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. Those were states that were still part of the Union, but still allowed slavery. And if you're wondering, why does a proclamation that didn't free anybody matter? It really does. Now, it is in part a political action. You know, it's to change the focus of the war away from the war being about preserving the Union, which is what Lincoln said it was at first, to the war being about ending slavery. So it changes the focus of the war, so that matters. It also allows African Americans in the South, when they get the news, which doesn't happen immediately, you know, because one, it's Lincoln and people in the South aren't listening to him. And two, if you're a slave owner, you're not going to say like, hey, guess what happened today? Lincoln said you guys are free. So, and then not a lot of slaves reading the newspaper, you know, that sort of thing. So it took lots of slave communities quite a while to find out about the Emancipation Proclamation. That's why there's that celebration of Juneteenth, if you ever wondered what that was. That's when slaves in the South or in different states in Texas, in particular, it's in June, hence Juneteenth, found out about the Emancipation Proclamation. So, but former slaves in the North found out about it much sooner. And what ends up happening is hundreds of thousands of former slaves volunteer to fight in the military. And this matters a lot in the middle of a war to get a couple 100,000 new troops who are fresh and, you know, not worn out, that sort of thing. And these guys are really, really motivated. Now, the book will talk quite a bit about how at first they weren't necessarily allowed to be in combat, but by the time, it doesn't take very long, they're allowed to be in combat. They're going to be paid equal wages, this sort of stuff. So you're going to see some really unusual advances because of the Emancipation Proclamation and because of the numbers of former slaves, of free blacks in the North, who then volunteer to fight in a war that's to free the slaves. You know, the preserving the Union, maybe not that exciting or inspirational of a cause. Freeing the slaves, much more so for some people. Now, I've suggested to you more than once that probably even most people drafted fighting in the war who did not volunteer, probably not as excited about freeing the slaves. They're very motivated to defeat the South. So you have a really broad mix of people with very diverse reasons for fighting. And also there's some guys just fighting because they got drafted and they didn't have a choice. Lots and lots of people getting drafted in the North and the South. Okay, so as the North becomes more able to, let's see. Oh, yeah, as the North becomes more able to win battles, Lincoln becomes more focused on the issue of slavery. And that's when the primary objective of the North switches, as I already mentioned. And after the Emancipation Proclamation, gradual emancipation begins in Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. So by the end of the war, slavery had ended in those states as well. So by the end of the war, you have the 13th Amendment. gradual emancipation's already been achieved in those states, and then every state that gets captured, I suppose, by the Union, one of the immediate things that happens is slavery ends. So, Emancipation Proclamation does not immediately free slaves, but it sets the country on the path of ending slavery and motivates nearly 200,000 soldiers to join the conflict so that they can help end slavery. And Frederick Douglass consults really regularly with Abraham Lincoln. Sometimes Douglass goes to the White House, sometimes Lincoln goes to Douglass's house. They're within walking distances of each other, which is interesting. If you ever tour Washington, D.C., now is probably not the best time to do that. But if you've done it before or in a year or two when everything is closer to normal and you can do it again, it's kind of cool to get to go to Cedar Hill, which is Douglass's house as well, and visit there as well. But interesting to explore the relationship that Douglass and Lincoln had. And they talked frequently about issues of race, but also regarding the war, that sort of stuff, and primarily about the treatment of Black soldiers. Frederick Douglass was older. He's not volunteering for the military, but his son did. And his son served in the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, the Glory Regiment. If you've seen that movie, it's really good. It's kind of old, but it's a really good movie. You can't show it in high school because the first scene, somebody loses an important body part. To a certain extent, African Americans are treated better, allowed in combat, and paid equally. And Douglass really thought that freeing the slaves was the beginning of the movement for equality and freedom for former slaves. So it's really just the beginning, not the end. And, lots and lots of people will agree. And we'll talk more about that as we talk about as we talk about Reconstruction. So Douglass thought that former slaves should show ownership of their own fight for freedom by participating directly in the war. And he certainly went around recruiting African Americans to join the war effort and was a large part of the reason that so many people volunteered. Okay, so during the Civil War, civilian rights were somewhat limited. I must have been having a weird day when I wrote that. They're extremely limited, extremely limited, both in the North and the South. In the North, they suspend the writ of habeas corpus. And I know you're going like, dang, I can't believe they suspended the writ of habeas corpus. Are you upset about that? Are you okay with that? You're going like, just tell us what the writ of habeas corpus is. You learned it in your government class. I know you remember it. Writ of habeas corpus means that they don't have to, if they suspend the writ of habeas corpus, they don't have to tell you why you were arrested, and they can just keep you in jail for an unlimited amount of time. So suspending the writ of habeas corpus means that you don't have to be told what crime you're charged with, and that they can just keep you in custody. So the really famous case where Abraham Lincoln personally had this done was to this guy named Lambton Milligan, who was really irritating to Abraham Lincoln in the middle of the war. So late 62 into 63. Milligan is suggesting that his state secede from the Union and join the Confederacy because Lincoln's doing such a terrible job running the war effort. Well, his state's Indiana. Indiana's not going to secede. It's not going to join the Confederacy. But it was just irritating to Lincoln. And there were some guys in Illinois doing similar stuff. So to kind of send a message and make an example, they arrested Lambton Milligan, didn't tell him why, and held him in jail for years, until the war was over. And then he'll eventually have a trial where he's convicted of treason and sentenced to death. Dang. For being very irritating. Not really fomenting a rebellion, but suggesting one during the middle of a war. And the Supreme Court said, no. He's going to appeal his death sentence, as he should. The Supreme Court will take that appeal, and they say no. Couple of problems. One, you can't just suspend the Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, and Eighth Amendments because of a war. And two, he's a civilian. You couldn't give him a military tribunal. They gave him a court martial. You can't do that because he's a civilian. So Supreme Court said nope, and then he eventually gets out. Now he gets out after the war's over, but he's held for a long time. So ex parte Milligan is that case, but the North is going to suspend a lot of civil liberties. You'll see this kind of stuff happen from time to time, although not nearly as egregiously as this case. But also people's freedom of speech is going to be limited quite a bit. And then there's going to be a draft as well, which some people will wonder, can we do that? Can we not do that? Certainly the Supreme Court is not concerned about drafts. I mean, it does take away your liberty just a bit, but it's a time of war, that sort of thing. The book also mentions quite a bit of what the South does in practicing martial law and confiscation. And we'll talk more about that specifically. We'll start off the next class talking about that, because that's really weekly question stuff. So I know you really want to talk about that, but that starts on page 546 for chapter 14 weekly question. And it's kind of interesting. I don't want to spoil all the fun for you, but it's kind of interesting to see how the South really becomes much more, I don't know that dictatorial is quite the right word, but the way that they run their government really takes away more individual rights than the way the North runs their government. So we'll talk about that more specifically next time to get you a little bit ready for the weekly question. But if you're in a hurry, just look at 546 and like 4 or 5 pages after that, and that'll give you some pretty good suggestions about what to put in that answer. But we'll talk about it specifically next class. All right. In the meantime, the U.S. government continues with non-Civil War activities, which I always think is fascinating, how much the government actually does in the middle of the Civil War that you don't really think about. They passed something called the Morrill Land Grant Act, which sells government-owned land and uses the proceeds to build colleges kind of in the middle of the country, A&M or A&I colleges. The A&M is agricultural, usually in mechanical. It can be mineral, depends on where it is. If it's in a mining area, sometimes it's mineral or mining. And A&I is agricultural and industrial. And I think in Texas, the college that was Texas A&I a long time ago was the one that's, I think it's now Texas A&M Kingsville. It's the college at Kingsville. I think it's Texas A&M. I really don't know. When I was there, it was just, what was it? Because my friend went there and she was telling me about it. I don't remember what it was in Kingsville, but yeah, all right. Let's see, purchase of Alaska. We buy Alaska during this time period because we need more land and it's cheap, and we bought it from Russia, and why the heck not? We plan the Transcontinental Railroad during this time period, and the plan is to go from Nebraska all the way to California to really connect the East to the West. There's lots and lots of railroads. The book talks about this quite a bit, previous chapter and a little bit in this chapter and more later. Lots of railroads from east to the middle of the country, just not very many from middle to west. And connecting that is going to change commerce pretty dramatically. Congress passes the Homestead Act during this time period, which is when you guys talked about the free land and free soil, you were talking about giving away free land in the West. And the Homestead Act is the biggest act that does that. It gets several million families to the West with essentially free land. They have to pay a tiny bit to register it, and I know we've talked about this before, but to get free land in the West, you'd have to have enough provisions to take with you because, there's no H-E-B or Walmart out there. So, or Tractor Supply. So when you get there, there's not a place to buy stuff. So you have to be wealthy enough to get a wagon, and a really narrow wagon, as we discovered, and stock it full of stuff to last you for quite a while. So it's hard for poor people to get the free land, but middle class people can get the free land. And that's what happens quite a bit. So Congress passes the Homestead Act to do that. And the government wants to fill up the land from east to west because this will give more incentive, that's an interesting word that I chose there, for Native Americans to stay onto reservations, which we'll talk about a little bit in this chapter as well, because we're also going to conduct a little bit of pushing natives onto reservations and fighting with natives during the Civil War as well. So several million families will relocate to the West. About a third of these families will end up keeping their farms for more than 5 years. The rest of them go like, nope, this was too hard. And they sell their land to the guys that were doing well. And they typically form small towns and start little businesses, but they usually stay in the West because the trip back is pretty far and they're already there. And, there's still some business opportunities. As far as more business opportunities, because of the war, manufacturing is increasing quite a bit. And so shipping becomes more important. Cornelius Vanderbilt runs steamship lines, but also railroads, and makes a lot of money from the steam shipping to purchase the railroads. And he also is going to help establish the telegraph lines, and they typically run near the railroad lines. So Vanderbilt is going to make a ridiculous amount of money from the Civil War, and then he'll become famous and start a university, and his family will spend a lot of money. And then Anderson Cooper is a Vanderbilt, so they're still around. Yeah, Vanderbilt, go team. All right, so lots of money for a handful of guys during that time period. Carnegie and Rockefeller are also going to start to gain a little bit of money in this era. Their fortunes get bigger a little bit later, but all of these guys are going to start to do well. And what you see as a result of the Civil War and the activities of the Union government during the Civil War is this dramatic expansion of business, really over agricultural concerns. So you start to see a more modern business, what am I trying to say? More modern industrial economy begin to develop. So it's really kind of Industrial Revolution round one, or really round two, isn't it? Because we had round one in the 30s, and this is kind of the beginning of round two, the more mechanized version. So, and this will expand all, until about 1900, until we're a fairly mechanized country that becomes one of the greatest producers in the world. So this is an interesting shift in the economy that comes in part because of the Civil War. And not everything's going great in the North, but a lot of things are. The economy, that sort of stuff. We'll leave the rest of the stuff for next time. But we'll talk really in particular about we'll start off with the weekly question, and then we'll go on to the stuff that's not going quite as well in the North. So weekly question, and then the rest of the notes for next time. So I don't want to go on too much longer, even though I still have a little time, don't I? I could still keep going. All right. So before we go, I'm going to write, don't leave just yet. Don't leave. What are you thinking? All right. I'll remind you weekly question and alternate question, or not alternate, but additional. Basic premise of the Confederate government. What advantages did the Confederacy have, and why did its leaders think victory would be theirs? I would start, beginning of the chapter probably helps a little, but also around page 546. And we will talk very, very specifically about this as class starts next time. And then your optional question really is this: explain one extremely important event mentioned in this class, textbook, or lecture that was not directly a part of the weekly question. explain what the event was and why it was a significant part of U.S. history in the era of the class. Okay, so more details and analysis equals more points, and you have to turn that in on time. And I think it's May, I can't remember. I don't even want to lie to you, but I think it's the Monday after the book review, but it's in the assignments page. So I'll get the date before I see you next time. All right, before we go, I'm going to stop the recording.